The first time my husband handed me a uniform instead of a wedding gift, I smiled and said thank you. I didn't know yet that the building he wanted me cleaning was mine. Not mine like a nice apartment I'd saved for.
Mine.
The whole tower. The name on the deed. The fortune underneath it. And by the time he found out, it was already too late for him to take any of it back. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. And if stories like this one keep you up at night wondering how people fool themselves for so long, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. My name is Adeline Cross. 3 years ago, I was folding towels in a supply closet on the 14th floor of the Verado Grand, the crown jewel of a hotel empire called Solace Hospitality Group. My husband's family ran that empire. I wore a gray polyester uniform with my hair pinned back, so tightly it gave me headaches by noon. My name tag said Ada, because my mother-in-law decided Adeline sounded, in her words, a little too much like the woman who used to own this place. She had no idea how right and how wrong she was at the same time. To understand how I ended up scrubbing marble floors in a hotel I would later learn belonged to me, you have to go back further. Not to the wedding. Not even to the day I met my husband. You have to go back to a man I never got to call grandfather while he was alive. His name was Desmond Wickham Cross, and he built an empire out of a single roadside motel in a town most maps don't bother to label. I grew up hearing his name in fragments, the way you hear thunder before you understand there's a storm. My mother rarely spoke of him. When she did, her voice went quiet, careful, like she was handling something breakable. All I really knew was that my mother had once been part of a wealthy family, that something had broken beyond repair between her and her father, and that she'd walked away from all of it before I was even born. She raised me on a teacher's salary in a 2-bedroom rental, and she was proud of that. She wanted me to build something with my own hands, not inherit someone else's mess. So when I met Julian Solis at 26, in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the accounting firm where I worked entry-level reconciliation reports, I wasn't thinking about empires or inheritances. I was thinking about how he laughed at my terrible jokes like they were actually funny, and how he remembered the name of my childhood dog after I mentioned it exactly once. Julian was, on paper, everything a modest woman is warned to be careful around. His family owned Solace Hospitality Group, 41 luxury properties across 3 continents, a name synonymous with old money and older manners. But in those early months, none of that seemed to matter to him. He drove a normal car. He wore the same 3 sweaters on rotation. He told me on our 4th date that he didn't want one of those women who only sees the name on the building. He wanted someone real. I believed him completely. That was my first mistake, though I wouldn't understand it as a mistake until much, much later. Because wanting someone real and wanting someone who would never challenge you for power are not always the same desire, even when they sound identical coming out of the same mouth. We married quietly, at his mother's insistence, in a small private ceremony that made the society pages anyway. Vivian Solis, my new mother-in-law, greeted me at the reception with a hug that felt like it had been measured out with a ruler. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "We'll find something useful for you to do around here." I thought she meant a charity board. I thought wrong. For the first 8 months of our marriage, life was almost normal. Julian and I lived in a modest condo he'd kept from before we met, separate from the family compound, and I kept my accounting job. I told myself the Solace Empire was his family's business, not mine, and that I was fine building my own small, steady life beside it rather than inside it. Then the recession hit the mid-tier hospitality sector, and my accounting firm let go of 40% of its staff. I was one of them. I remember sitting on our kitchen floor with the termination letter in my hands, terrified of what would happen next, and Julian kneeling down beside me with an answer that seemed, at the time, like a gift. "Come work with us," he said. "Just until you find something else. My mother's been looking for reliable staff at the Verado. You'll get full benefits. It's temporary." I should have asked what kind of staff. I didn't. I was scared and grateful and in love, and those 3 things together make people agree to almost anything. What I discovered on my very first day was that reliable staff meant housekeeping. not management, not the front office, where a woman with my accounting background might have made sense. Housekeeping, on the guest floors, alongside 22 other women who had no idea I was married to the family that owned the building they cleaned every single day. I asked Julian about it that night, gently, expecting an explanation that would make it make sense. Instead, he told me it was better this way. If people know you're my wife, he said, they'll treat you differently. This way you get to learn the business from the ground up, like I did. It sounded almost noble, the way he said it. It would take me nearly 2 years to understand that he had never once, in his entire life, pushed a housekeeping cart down a hallway or scrubbed a bathtub on his knees. The ground floor he claimed to have learned from was an executive training program with a corner office and a mentor. Mine was a supply closet and a woman named Marisol who taught me, on my first shift, how to fold a fitted sheet into a perfect hospital corner in under 90 seconds. I want to pause here and tell you something important because it matters for everything that comes after. I was not ashamed of the work itself. Cleaning is honest labor, and the women I worked beside for the next 2 years became some of the fiercest, funniest, most loyal people I have ever known. What I was ashamed of, slowly, quietly, over months, was the lie underneath it. The way Julian introduced me at family functions as helping out with operations, instead of saying the truth. The way Vivian would walk past me in the hallway at the Verado without a flicker of recognition, because to her, a maid was furniture that happened to move. The way my own husband began gradually to speak to me the same way. By the end of the first year, something in our marriage had shifted in a direction I couldn't quite name yet, but could absolutely feel. Julian started coming home later. He started correcting the way I set the table, the way I dressed for family dinners, the way I spoke in front of his colleagues. Small corrections at first. The kind you can convince yourself don't mean anything. But small corrections, repeated enough times, become a cage built one bar at a time, and you don't notice you're inside it until you try to reach through the space where a door used to be. Here's the detail that should have told me everything, months before it finally did. Every year, on the second Friday of October, Solace Hospitality Group held what they called Founders Week, a company-wide celebration of Desmond Whitcomb Cross's original motel, the one that started it all. There were framed photographs of him in every property lobby. There was a black and white portrait of him hanging directly outside the Verado's grand ballroom, the same portrait I dusted with a microfiber cloth every single Thursday for 2 years without ever once looking closely enough to recognize my own grandfather's face. That's not a metaphor. That's exactly what happened. I dusted a photograph of the man whose name would eventually unlock my entire life, and I never once made the connection, because my mother had changed our last name legally after the falling out, and because grief, when it's inherited instead of lived, doesn't come with a family album to compare faces against. The unraveling began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day nobody remembers until it becomes the day everything changed. I was refilling a housekeeping cart on the 14th floor when I overheard 2 members of the executive team speaking in hushed, tense voices near the service elevator. One of them, a senior director named Prescott Hale, was holding a thick folder marked Confidential, Trust Transition. They're saying the missing beneficiary clause finally cleared probate, he said. If legal can't locate her in 90 days, the entire holding company reverts to the alternate trustee. The other executive, a woman I didn't recognize, lowered her voice further. Do we even know if she's alive? It's been, 26 years since the falling out. I remember freezing behind that housekeeping cart, not because I understood what they meant, but because something in the words missing beneficiary made the hair on my arm stand up, the way your body sometimes knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I told myself it was just corporate gossip, the kind that floats through every large company. I pushed the cart to the next room and finished my shift and said nothing to anyone, including Julian. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed running the phrase over and over. Missing beneficiary. Alternate trustee. 26 years. My mother had walked away from her father's world exactly 26 years before I was born into this uniform. The math sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. I didn't do anything reckless. I didn't confront anyone. I did what I'd always done when something frightened me, which was to become quietly, methodically thorough. Over the following weeks, in the small gaps between shifts, I started paying closer attention to the things I'd walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing. The framed portrait outside the ballroom, the engraved plaque in the lobby honoring founder Desmond W. Cross, 1948 to the present legacy. The way older employees, the ones who'd been with the company for decades, sometimes stopped in front of that photograph like they were paying respects at a grave. One afternoon, an older bellman named Otis, who had worked at the Verado since it first opened its doors, caught me staring at the portrait longer than usual. "You know," he said quietly, "the old man had a daughter. Ran off decades ago after some falling out nobody talks about anymore. Company's been looking for her people ever since. Rumor is there's a granddaughter out there somewhere who doesn't even know what she's sitting on." I laughed it off, the way you laugh off something too enormous to actually process, standing in a hallway holding a stack of folded towels. But that night, I called my mother for the first time in months and asked her, as gently as I could, to finally tell me the truth about her father. About why she left. About what exactly she'd walked away from. What she told me over the phone that night rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. My mother had not simply had a disagreement with her father, the way she'd always implied. She had been disinherited, publicly and painfully, after refusing to marry a man he'd chosen for her, a business alliance dressed up as a wedding. She left with nothing but her name, which she quietly changed within the year to protect herself from being found and pressured back. She never told her father she was pregnant with me, because by then the wound between them had scarred over into something neither of them knew how to reopen. "Desmond Wickham Cross died 4 years ago," my mother said, her voice cracking for the first time in the conversation, believing his only child had abandoned him completely, never knowing he had a granddaughter at all. "There's a trust," she admitted finally, almost in a whisper, like saying it out loud might summon consequences she still feared after all these years. "His lawyers reached out to me after he passed. I never responded. I didn't want any part of that world touching you. I thought I was protecting you." I sat on my kitchen floor for the second time in 2 years, holding a phone instead of a termination letter, and I understood, with a kind of dizzy, disbelieving clarity, that the empire I mopped floors inside every single day was not just my husband's family business. Buried somewhere in a trust document with my mother's maiden name on it was a clause that could mean the entire company legally belonged, eventually, to me. I didn't tell Julian. Not that night, not the next week. I told myself I needed to understand the situation fully before I said anything, but if I'm honest with myself now, there was another reason underneath that one. A quieter, sadder reason. I wanted to see what he would do, and what his mother would do, if they believed the woman in the housekeeping uniform was still just the woman in the housekeeping uniform. I wanted to know if the love I thought I'd married was real, or if it had only ever been convenient. What I learned over the following weeks broke something in me that has never fully grown back the same shape. It started small. Vivian began assigning me the worst shifts, the ones nobody wanted, after a guest complained that a housekeeper hadn't smiled warmly enough while restocking a minibar. She called me into her office, the same office where I would one day sit on the other side of the desk, and told me that my attitude was becoming a liability to the family name. I asked her, carefully, what attitude she meant. She said I'd been asking too many questions of the senior staff. Word travels fast in a hotel. Someone had mentioned my conversation with Otis. That same week, I found a printout tucked into a folder in the small shared office where housekeeping staff clocked in and out. It wasn't meant for me to see. It was an internal memo from legal counsel, addressed to Vivian and Julian both, regarding what it called the pending trust matter. The memo explained, in careful corporate language, that the 90-day window to locate the missing beneficiary was closing, and that if she remained unidentified, controlling interest in Solace Hospitality Group would legally transfer, permanently, to the current executive leadership. In other words, to Vivian, and eventually to Julian. I stood there holding that memo with my heart pounding so loudly, I thought someone might hear it, because now I understood something far more dangerous than a housekeeping assignment. My husband's family did not merely not know I was the missing beneficiary. They were actively, quietly, hoping she would never be found at all. Every day that passed without my identity surfacing was a day that moved the entire fortune permanently into their hands. And I was standing in their hallway, wearing their uniform, cleaning their toilets, closer to that fortune than any lawyer they'd hired to search for me. That night, I asked Julian directly for the first time what he knew about his family's missing beneficiary situation. I watched his face carefully as I said it. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes, something between guilt and calculation, before he smoothed it over into practiced concern. "It's complicated legal stuff, Ada," he said, using the shortened name his mother had given me instead of my own. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Why are you even asking about that?" "Because I heard someone mention it," I said. It sounded important. "It's important to the company," he said. "Not to us." And then he changed the subject to something about dinner reservations, so smoothly that if I hadn't already read the memo myself, I might have believed there was nothing more to it at all. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether to tell him the truth, and started wondering instead how much of our marriage had been built on the assumption that I would never find out what he already suspected. Because looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after everything falls apart, I believe Julian knew, or at least strongly suspected, exactly who I was long before I did. My mother's maiden name was in that trust. I will never know with total certainty whether Julian married me because he loved me, or because some part of him recognized my mother's name on a piece of paper and understood, on some level even he might not have admitted to himself, that keeping me close and keeping me small was the safest way to protect what his family stood to lose. What I do know is that he never once, in 3 years of marriage, encouraged me to look deeper into my own family history. Every time I mentioned my grandfather, even in passing curiosity, he steered the conversation somewhere else. Every time I hinted at wanting to understand my mother's past, he reminded me, gently, lovingly, that some things are better left buried. I spent the next several weeks living a kind of double life inside my own marriage. By day, I wore the uniform, folded the towels, dusted the portrait of the grandfather I now understood to be mine, and said nothing. By night, I quietly gathered everything I could. My mother, once she understood what was actually at stake, finally agreed to help me. She dug an old fireproof box out of a closet she hadn't opened in over a decade, and inside it, wrapped in a faded pillowcase, were the original documents her own lawyer had drawn up decades earlier. Her birth certificate, a sealed letter from Desmond, unopened for over 20 years, that she finally read aloud to me over the phone with her voice shaking the entire time. And most important of all, a certified copy of the original trust, naming her, and in the event of her death or continued absence, her direct descendants, as the rightful successor beneficiaries of the entire Cross family holding company, the parent entity that legally owned every share of Solace Hospitality Group. I hired my own lawyer in secret, a sharp, unflinching woman named Priya Anand who specialized in trust and estate disputes, and who looked at my documents for exactly 4 minutes before looking up at me and saying, "Mrs. Solace, do you understand that you may currently be sitting on one of the largest unclaimed inheritances in the state?" I told her I understood the paperwork. What I didn't understand yet was how enormous the number actually was, until she pulled the most recent internal valuation, filed quietly with regulators the year before, and turned her laptop screen toward me. The current market valuation of Solace Hospitality Group, real estate holdings, brand licensing, and international expansion projects included, was $487 billion. Within the year, projected growth from 3 properties already under construction in Southeast Asia would push that number past $500 billion. I sat in Priya's office with a printed valuation report in my lap, still wearing my housekeeping name tag because I'd come straight from a shift, and I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because it was the only response my body had left for a number that large attached to a life that small. Priya explained the mechanics carefully. The 90-day window Vivian's lawyers were racing against was real, but it worked both ways. If I could establish my identity as the legitimate beneficiary before that window closed, the trust would transfer to me automatically, cleanly, with no room for the company's current leadership to contest it later. If I waited even one day past that deadline, Everything, the hotels, the land, the brand, the fortune, would pass permanently and irreversibly into Vivian and Julian's control, and I would have no legal claim left at all. We had 11 days remaining. I want to be honest about what I felt in those 11 days because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was grief. I grieved a marriage I had believed in completely, watching it dissolve in my mind piece by piece as I re-examined every small cruelty, every careful redirection, every time Julian had called me Ada instead of my own name, in light of what I now understood. I grieved the version of myself who had genuinely believed hard work and love were enough to build a life on, only to discover I had been hiding an entire fortune's worth of standing behind a uniform the whole time, unknowingly and unnecessarily small. But grief, I learned, can share a room with resolve. And by the fourth day, resolve was winning.
I didn't quit my job.
I want you to understand that because it matters. I kept showing up to my shifts, kept folding sheets into hospital corners, kept dusting the portrait of the grandfather I now understood, while Priya and a small team of forensic accountants she brought in worked quietly behind the scenes to authenticate every document, cross-reference every signature, and prepare a filing that Vivian's legal team would not be able to contest, delay, or bury in procedural motions. I needed the element they least expected, which was time, and the safest way to buy time was to remain exactly what they already believed me to be. Invisible, beneath their notice. A maid and nothing more. On the 9th day, something happened that nearly unraveled everything. Vivian called an unscheduled all-staff meeting in the Verado's grand ballroom, the same ballroom outside which hung the portrait I had dusted 100 times. She announced, with visible relief in her voice, that the company's ongoing trust transition matter was expected to resolve favorably within the week, and that once it did, Solace Hospitality Group would be entering what she called a new era of unified family leadership. Julian stood beside her on the small raised platform, nodding along, his hand resting on his mother's shoulder in a gesture of practiced solidarity. I stood at the back of the ballroom in my gray uniform among 24 other housekeeping staff, watching the two people I had trusted most prepare to publicly celebrate the moment my entire inheritance would. I remember Julian's eyes passing over the crowd of staff during his brief remarks. They landed on me for exactly 1 second, long enough that I felt it, not long enough that he saw anything. That night, I went home and, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I did not cry. I called Priya instead and told her to file everything the moment it was ready. Not on the deadline. Not with a comfortable buffer of caution. As fast as legally possible. She filed on the 11th day, 4 hours before the deadline closed. What happened next unfolded faster than I could have predicted, and far more publicly than I had ever intended. Because the trust required, under the original terms Desmond had written decades earlier, that any successful claim by the missing beneficiary be formally announced to the company's full board of directors within 72 hours, to prevent exactly the kind of quiet internal power consolidation Vivian had been counting on. That meant a mandatory emergency board session. At the Verado. In the same grand ballroom where Vivian had stood 11 days earlier, promising everyone a new era of family leadership. I was asked to attend, formally, by name, for the first time since I'd started working there. Adeline Whitcomb Cross Solace. Not Ada. My name, in full, printed on an official board notice that was delivered to every director, every senior executive, and, because company policy required full transparency to staff representatives during a leadership transition, posted on the internal employee board as well. The same board where housekeeping staff checked their shift schedules every morning. I found out later that Marisol, the woman who had taught me to fold a fitted sheet on my very first day, was the one who read that notice out loud to the rest of the housekeeping team, because several of them couldn't quite believe what they were looking at. She told me afterward that the room went completely silent, and then someone asked, quietly, "Wait, is that our Ada?" I walked into that ballroom on the day of the emergency session wearing, for the first time in 3 years, a tailored charcoal suit instead of a uniform. I had asked Priya to walk in beside me, not because I needed her legal expertise in that exact moment, but because I wanted, after everything, to walk into that room with someone who had believed me before anyone else did. The look on Vivian's face when I walked through those doors is something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not shock exactly. Something closer to the moment a person realizes the floor they've been standing on was never load-bearing at all. Julian rose halfway out of his chair, then sat back down slowly, his mouth opening and closing without finding a single word to fill the silence with. Priya spoke first, calmly, clearly, laying out the authenticated trust documents, the certified lineage, the forensic verification, in language so measured and so complete that by the time she finished, not one lawyer in that room, including Vivian's own legal counsel, raised a single objection. Because there was nothing left to object to. The paperwork was airtight. The deadline had been met. The company, in its entirety, now belonged to me. I stood up, then, and I said something I had rehearsed quietly in my car that morning, though I never expected to actually need it because some small part of me had still hoped Julian would say something first.
He didn't. So I did.
I've spent the last 2 years cleaning rooms 14 floors above the office where my grandfather's portrait hangs, I said. I dusted that photograph every week for 2 years without knowing it was him. I want everyone in this room to understand that I'm not telling you this because I'm proud of not knowing. I'm telling you because for 2 of those years, the people closest to me knew far more than I did, and chose silence anyway. I watched Vivian's face harden into something brittle and offensive. I watched Julian's face do something far worse. Nothing at all. He simply stared at the table in front of him, and in that stillness, I understood, with a finality that closed something inside my chest, that whatever love had existed between us had never been. I had the portrait of my grandfather moved from outside the ballroom to my new office, the same office that used to belong to Vivian. I look at it every morning now, and instead of a stranger's face I used to dust without seeing, I see the outline of my own jaw, the shape of my own stubbornness, staring back at me from a photograph taken decades before I existed. People sometimes ask me now whether I regret those 2 years in a housekeeping uniform, whether I wish I'd known sooner who I really was and what I really owned. I tell them the truth, which is that I don't regret a single shift, because those 2 years taught me something no boardroom ever could have. They taught me exactly which people treat you with respect when they believe you have nothing to offer them, and exactly which people only discover their affection for you the moment your net worth becomes public record. I learned who Marisol was before I ever knew what I was worth on paper. I learned who Julian was too, and both lessons turned out to be worth more than the inheritance itself. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Being underestimated is not the same thing as being powerless. Sometimes the very people trying hardest to keep you small are the ones who suspect, deep down, exactly how much you're capable of holding once you finally stand up straight. Don't let anyone convince you that quiet means weak, that patient means foolish, or that a uniform, any uniform, defines the size of the life you're actually meant to live. I lost a husband. I lost the version of a family I thought I'd married into. But I found the truth of exactly who I am, and I found it standing in the very hallway where someone once tried to make sure I never would. And in the end, that turned out to be worth infinitely more than $500 billion, even though, as it happens, I got to keep both.